All right, welcome back, folks, for another episode of the Unplanned Show. With me today, I have a guest, Jason Flint, who leads our workplaces and crisis management here at PagerDuty. Say hello, Jason.
Hello, everyone.
Before we dive into the topic of today, I will just cover a quick housekeeping about some upcoming episodes. Next week, we will have Jake Cohen on to talk about generative AI and automation. And then looking a little further out, we have scheduled an upcoming episode with Meg Watson of Spotify and PagerDuty's own Tiago Barbosa on our advocates team to talk about PagerDuty's plugin for Backstage. Raise your hand if you didn't know that there was a plugin for Backstage for PagerDuty. That was a fun thing to learn about, and actually some really interesting details to look forward to. Looking forward to those. And today, it is September 11th, which is, of course, an important day of remembrance for certainly folks here in the US. And it also has kind of been something of sort of whether catalyzing or inspiring, however you want to call it, but this National Preparedness Month. And Jason, this is something you spearhead a lot internally at PagerDuty around this preparedness month, and a lot of engagement and education and activities for employees around the world. But I wanted to kind of just step back and learn a little bit more, like where did this really, like, how did this evolve in the last 20 odd years, and what does it really mean? I mean, the types of things that people need to prepare for, we've really sort of unfortunately been reminded year after year about how many different situations arise that really require being prepared, and there are all kinds of different crises. But what can you tell us a little bit to think about Preparedness Month?
Yeah, so within our organization, like we really started off as a few years ago as National Preparedness Month, and I think that's the term everyone uses in the U.S. specifically. And then, like, sort of knowing that we're a global organization and that there's dangers all over the world and threats exist everywhere, we started to coin it as Global Preparedness Month, right? Because we want all of our teams and all of our folks across seas and even here in the U.S. And now as we start thinking about like this hybrid work scenario and protecting people at home as well, it's really more about a global sort of state of readiness and state of preparedness versus just here in the U.S. And so that really grew into this this campaign that we run annually here at PagerDuty, where we really engage with our employees and challenge them to learn about the different threats that are out there and the different natural disasters that are in some cases sort of record breaking and first of its kind. We just went through a global pandemic, right? No one thought that was something that would happen within their lifespan. So I think it's really just understanding the amount of threats out there, and then just having plans in place, making sure that you're ready with your disaster kit or your disaster resources, and then just really practicing it day in and day out and staying vigilant as much as possible.
So you mentioned kind of using the awareness month as an opportunity to educate folks about the different types of threats. And then there's probably a huge range and spectrum in terms of like the maturity in which you can be in terms of like your preparedness. What do you think is kind of like, what is the hope that a month of sort of education and engagement, like what's that level of how do we move the dial? Like, what are we hoping to get out of doing kind of this type of thing for a month versus what do we need to do, week in, week out across an organization to think about that type of preparedness?
Yeah, a really great question. Yeah, I think there's so many different levels of preparedness, right? And we actually just ran a training last week where we talked about situational awareness and having that that spectrum from where you're sort of overly alert and overly prepared to the point where it brings paralysis, right? We don't want folks to be like thinking about everything bad that can potentially happen at every moment of the day. And that's really why we rely on our first responders, emergency managers, and crisis professionals out there, is that they do all the scenario planning for us, and sort of determine the best pathways forward in order for us to focus our efforts. Because you can plan for like every single scenario, but you're not going to get much accomplished because there's always something else that's going to happen that's going to be a little bit different than what you planned for. And I cover this in the guide when I talk about sort of planning for some fringe events that you may not see every once in a while, something like a social media attack. Yeah, so those are the type of scenarios, and you can really get creative with like thinking about the different things that could happen, and really just focusing in on those specific ones for your organization that are going to be high impact, I think, is the important thing. And then from there, just sort of thinking about what your maturity looks like. What's your desired outcome if your organization does face a crisis in that realm? Is it to eliminate the threat immediately? Is it to sort of manage it because it's a complex and protracted sort of crisis? Is it to make sure your customers are informed or notified about what's going on? So really just understanding what your end goal is, and then just building back from that.
Yeah, you bring up a really interesting point of like that balance between wanting to make sure like a broader employee population is educated and engaged enough to be, prepared and take like able to respond appropriately, but not like everyone goes out and is like hardcore prepping, which actually, now that you kind of brought that up, is like it would be potentially counterproductive, right? Because so much of the crisis response is about coordinating across teams, right? So some person who's like, I've figured it all out and I'm gonna do all the things, but it's really only within my sphere, then like that doesn't really help the whole organization sort of gain resilience in the face of a crisis, right? So when you think about what are those like you're crossing team boundaries and you're crossing like what hits at the bigger group. This kind of gets to something you mentioned, which was going to be the next sort of line of questioning I had for you, which was around the ops guides and the updates that you made recently, and I can drop a link for folks that are specific to crisis response management operations. So maybe tell us a little bit more about what that kind of gets into, and that sort of the org level response as opposed to just individuals.
Yeah, absolutely. So in this guide, it's specifically focused on sort of speed off the line, your mean time to respond, and really just getting you to a place where you are ready, you are prepared for a whole host of scenarios, and you've practiced it, you've run through it in a more realistic sort of way using functional exercises rather than tabletop exercises, which I talk about in the guide. And so this is really understanding as an organization that like there's so many stakeholders that you need to communicate with and work with in order to resolve a situation. So building in both the business resilience and just personal resilience as well is super important right now. And so this guide really captures a lot of that sort of guidance and best practices, and also talks about how we use PagerDuty to really manage a lot of that and sort of make it easier for us to manage a crisis.
So what are some of the things like the recent learnings that have informed the updates that you made here? Because this isn't a completely new practice, but what's new that like maybe we didn't know about or we didn't have the capability of doing in quite as elegant a way?
Yeah, I think, you put that really great way. Like there's no new philosophy here, right? It's still identify a problem, find it, and fix it. It's still the same sort of process. And what I try to accomplish here is start looking at the level of execution. At the crisis level, you need to be executing at a high level within your organization. And so really bringing in that collaborative focus, and using the product to do that is extremely important in a crisis, because everyone is going to react differently. There's going to be a lot of human behavioral changes from normal operations to crisis operations that you also have to manage. And so just really understanding that you want to execute at a high level, and using the platform to do that is going to be beneficial in the long run.
Yeah. Um, you know, broadly, like what are some of the things that have been like interesting challenges and learnings that you've had in the last couple of years as this sort of, every couple of months almost, it seems like something comes along that it might be isolated to only like a certain community or a certain part of the world, or there's a certain domain within the organization, but it's kind of all those scenarios, I would imagine, sort of like stress the process. And to your point, like the execution model. Just curious, like what have you learned like recently from some of the things that have come up?
Yeah, there were so many learnings from the pandemic, and just being involved in this like 2 to 3 year long running crisis, right?
Yeah.
So I think, aside from what I talked about earlier in terms of fringe events and thinking outside of the box about some of the threats that may impact you, I also talk about perfect storm scenarios where there's multiple crises happen at the same time, sort of impacting your operations, and how prepared are you to really deal with that?
Mm.
Usually, an organization is going to be prepared to deal with one crisis, maybe some smaller issues here and there, but multiple ones at the same time are going to be a lot harder, especially if you don't have the resources and staff to deal with it. So I think that's one learning, just thinking outside the box in terms of the threats that you're sort of assessing or planning for. And then another one is to just practice like your company depends on it, because a lot of exercises really drive home those habits and help you sort of react instinctively when things do happen, rather than sort of scrambling, looking for plans or trying to create new processes. So I think the more that you can execute practice and training within the organization and make it realistic, and make it functional, like throw in a systems test or throw in a team activation or something like of that nature, just to get folks used to the pattern and the habits. I think that's really important too.
Yeah, it sounds a lot like the sort of chaos engineering approaches and practices, game days and whatnot, where, we'll cut power to something over here. We will, inject some kind of failure into the system over here, but we've set that aside as something we're all aware of and going to practice. But here you're talking about kind of, yeah, simulate it for some other domain that's outside of your software development and stack, right, for how you're running your digital platforms, but something that might connect to customers or supply chain or something else. And so, are do some of those practices? I'm just curious, like, are folks looking at things like chaos engineering, or is really kind of more flowing the other way, where chaos engineering is learning from those types of preparedness practices? I've definitely heard Adrian Cocroft when he talks about it. Um, Engineering, he's like, hey, it's just like the fire drill. It's like, when your kids go off to school and every year they have practice fire drills so that they're ready. But we don't do this for things like, your software failing. So just curious, like, is there a two-way flow of kind of learnings in those different communities, or is it kind of more one way?
Yeah, I think there's probably a two-way. I think like there's a lot that both can learn from each other, and I think um, even just understanding like the way exercises impact sort of your thinking and your execution model as well, I think is extremely important. And then um, we talked about the fire drill, which, yeah, it's great to like sort of do it and check a box, but like, what are you really testing, right? Are
Mhm.
you testing the ability for people to walk out of a office in an organized fashion, or are you testing whether or not they know that if exit A is blocked, I need to go to exit B? Like, throw in some like hurdles and obstacles
Mm.
to really get them thinking, and I think that that will really go a long way in terms of helping them think on their feet.
So, I think that that brings up this other kind of thought I've been having on this topic, and I shared with you just before we went live. So my son's now he's just starting the scouts, and I was looking through all these merit badges, and it's like, holy moly! I mean, if you did all of this, like you would have be very well versed in a lot of um, scenarios, both for things that are kind of recreational, but can also introduce risks, right? So all of the aquatic activities, for example, but basic first aid and things like that are so useful. Um, and it's like you look at a program like that, and a small fraction of people go through something like that, and maybe get that kind of exposure and training when they're young, before they've kind of settled into, this is my day job and this is what I do, and I'll keep building skills within my domain, but I'm not out there learning how to do like a totally different thing, unless it happens to be a hobby maybe. And so it just kind of got me thinking, like, how much of that goes into that sort of preparedness mindset, where, like, how do you, across an organization, that idea of like put in an obstacle, get people to really think more holistically about the situation? Like, how much of, like, branch out just one, if everyone picked like one thing to get like the sort of the merit badge in, if you will, that's outside of their main domain, like across our population, we'd have a lot of people who covered a lot of different skills, even if we're dealing with an organization that's, hey, this is not what these people are here to do. It's not their job. But if we had more people on staff at any given point that knew a little bit more about, someone over there knew kind of first aid, and someone over there, knew something about, crisis communications, and someone over there knew a little bit more about some other sort of scenario, then together, right? Like, we'd be better off. Is there any kind of thinking about that in terms of skills broadening, that's just like, hey, this isn't a certification you need for your promotion, but it'd be a really good idea?
Yeah.
How do you motivate that?
That's really difficult. I think a lot of people don't like to go outside of their comfort zone and their sort of their box when it comes to, especially when it comes to their work, right? Like,
Yeah.
we're here to perform certain functions, and so going outside of that sometimes can feel a little uncomfortable. And so what we like to do in Global Preparedness Month is really gamify some of it and make it a little bit more fun, and have some contests, give away some swag. So things like that to help people both learn and also be competitive, and really just get something, something physical, something like tangible away from it as well. We recently did an exercise series where we sort of targeted that sort of mindset. Like, let's get people in the room who are in completely different departments. Let's throw them a crisis scenario and see how everyone responds. And so we were able to sort of understand how people view, crises within the organization and also within their own departments, and then sort of look at the overlaps and say, well, this team knows that this other team may view crisis more sensitive than another team. And so, like, some of those learnings from just getting people in a room or in a Zoom call and just running through scenarios, I think is really important.
That makes a lot of sense, and is like a really interesting way also, I'm sure, to just build some empathy across
No.
different functional groups, where they each kind of realize, like, oh, I didn't realize that would be a sort of a showstopper for you. Um, what other like ways and practices? I think I participated in some of the gamification. I believe I now have some really cool sort of emergency, it's like a radio flashlight combo. It's really cool. So I think I got one of those last year, and my husband was like very into it because he was the scout himself. So he's like, oh yeah, we need one of those. Um, but yeah, no, I love the idea of kind of just, yeah, the cross functional groups. I think one of the other questions I have is, like, I I I picture that room, and it's like, are you bringing together the VPs? And but then it's like, have we solidified? Have we kind of rotated too much where it's like, well, the leaders are the people that are the ones who are trained and aware of what to do in a crisis situation? Or how much do you think about distributing across different levels in an organization so that it's not like this is all knowledge and experience that gets kind of locked up at a very senior level, where what if those are some of the people who are affected? But also, how do you kind of just thinking about balancing that, or like making that part of the growth of different people in the organization? Just kind of curious, like when you bring those cross-functional groups together, do you think about levels of seniority, and having that mixed, or is there sort of, we actually need to make sure that all folks in leadership positions are at a baseline here? How do you think about that?
Yeah, I think pretty much both, kind of at the same time. So I think the mixed sort of group is something that I think is really important, because the senior leaders can drop some of the knowledge that they have for some of the younger folks in the organization, and vice versa in terms of like the thinking. And I think that's really important. The interpersonal elements during a crisis, as you're responding, as you're working collaboratively to solve things, that's important to build ahead of a crisis. And then, as you're looking at sort of your plans and your organizational structure and governance for crisis management, you do want to make sure your senior leaders have a better sense of sort of the structure, what to expect when a crisis does happen, and know sort of who's reporting what to who, and also, what's the breakdown in terms of the functions that are involved. So, we use incident commander principles within the organization, and that's a very hierarchical sort of structure. So it's very similar in terms of thinking about educating and making sure that leaders are prepared, and also their direct reports are prepared.
Yeah. And I mean, I would imagine that sometimes some of the really important insights about what would the impact of this scenario be might be better understood from, people who are not with the big title, right? But they're much closer to, that system or that particular process, or how something operates. Um, and so that makes sense. Like, it goes both ways.
Right.
You mentioned kind of the incident commander principles, and this just kind of coming back to that, to the guide, just looking at the different sections. You start off with terminology, which is great, because there's a lot of really specific phrases, and I feel like reading through that list, it's like I think back to, I don't know, some like every Gerard Butler movie you've seen, where it's like a White House down kind of scenario.
Exactly.
I had to update it because I was like, my first thought was, oh no, I'm blanking on his name, the Die Hard guy,
Bruce
Bruce
Willis.
Willis, right? I
Yeah.
was like, but I'm like, I feel like that's like a generation ago, and now it's like the Gerard Butler movie. Um, so that, those are the terminology, but there's like, it's great to actually learn what do those different words even mean.
Yeah.
And then there's the crisis leadership section, which is a little bit of like where I was kind of coming from, because there's a lot of really interesting and useful frameworks there, in terms of just, this is what this means. And then you get into the response operations, and this is where you start to get into how you can actually use PagerDuty applied to this scenario, which is outside sort of what people usually think of in terms of like a site reliability engineering domain, for keeping it responsive. What are some of the things that are kind of important, like adaptations,
Mhm.
if anything, that someone who's like, yes, you can extend how you're using PagerDuty and use it in this scenario? What are those adaptations for people to keep in mind? And I also, I noticed like you have like the incident, you're using kind of like workflows as well, which is a relatively new feature. that folks may not be aware of. And I'm curious, like, how do you think about what something like hey, we're going to kick off this workflow? How do you think about that in a crisis response scenario?
Yeah, I think something that's new that's probably, I mean, this is probably old school as well, but I think just being virtual and remote like changes the way we respond to crises now. Before it was, let's get everyone in a boardroom and let's discuss the situation.
Mm.
Now it's virtual. So you need a platform that can help you sort of do that and do it quickly. And so, like, PagerDuty has 700 plus integrations, right? You can figure out any certain way to contact people or get people onto a conference call very quickly. And incident workflows helps do that in an automated way, which, again, like in the old days, it wouldn't be automated. You have to pick up a phone and call, your decision tree or your call list. So yeah, I think the automation functions and really just centralizing everything into one platform is really important. And then whereas it's like technical operations, you're seeing all of these like system errors and all these whatever other reporting from network outages or infrastructure outages. Now you need to think about it in terms of like human like related issues, because those are going to be manual triggers. They're not going to be automated, right? So I think that's another way to look at it in terms of just switching over from technical to non-technical and just using the platform in a more manual function, but still using the automation to sort of kick off the response and get people notified and things like that.
Yeah, and I imagine following that process like really consistently. It's like, hey, we put a lot of thought into how we want to do this.
Yeah.
We hope that we don't ever have to, but if it comes up, we would really like to follow the process that we thought so hard about.
Exactly.
And so having it kind of not just written down, but set up to actually execute as you plan.
Yeah.
As you had planned for. Okay, that was something that I was just curious about, because it seemed like, pretty, a rapid adaptation of something that was a new feature in a platform, but now it's being applied in this scenario.
Yeah.
So then I guess just like kind of closing thoughts, like what are sort of, things you would want to leave with folks to think about in terms of just what's that next step that they can take, and in terms of better preparing for responding and managing a crisis situation?
Yeah, that's a really big question. Yeah, I think so many things, but I think the most important thing is to just do some horizon scanning. Think about what's gonna be the most critical sort of hit for you, and think about it in a space where it's not plain and something that you've seen before, right? Make it a little bit more creative in terms of the scenario. Think about the different like impacts across the organization, across not just crisis, but like business continuity, your cybersecurity team. Think about your brand and your reputation as well. That's a really important one. So just really look at your crisis management preparations and preparedness holistically.
Yeah, thinking holistically and sort of scanning the horizon and thinking holistically is I think there's one thing people walk away from this discussion and do, then that seems like a good starting point.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jason. It was enlightening to sort of chat with you about this.
Yeah.
Just a reminder for folks, next week we'll have Jake Cohen on talking about generative AI and automation. And then look out in a few more weeks after that, we'll have Meg Watson and Tiago Barbosa talking about Backstage and the PagerDuty plugin for that. So thank you again, and have a wonderful rest of your day.